Okay, so today I'm going to go over rental calculations. We're going to go over the add back calculation, and we're going to go over the offset calculation. If I've got time, I'm going to show you what a rental worksheet looks like, but I might not get there. We're going to try to keep this under half an hour. All right, so first off, I want you guys to understand that rentals, they can be any kind of sort of transaction, because we might see a rental that is a basement suite, and there's a certain kind of calculation for basement suites. It might be a standalone property, and it might be that the standalone property is being purchased, so it's the subject property, or it might be that there's already an existing rental and the clients are buying another principal residence. So there's various ways that we could see a rental, and because of all of that, we just kind of have to know what the two calculations look like. And really, I wanted to give you a sense of which one ends up being a bit better for the client. So that all being said, does anyone have any questions to start?
Which lender are you going to use for your example?
I'm not going to use any lender. I'm purely doing the academic side of it. Like, what does it look like to calculate this? So I'm not gonna say this lender uses 50% or that lender uses 80. I'm just gonna say, here's what happens if it is 80, or here's what happens if it's an add back. Here's what happens if it's an offset.
Okay.
All right. So it's pure, because I want people to understand why one is better than the other. Okay. If you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat or the comments, or put your hand up, and I'll do my best to watch. But I have a few screens going here. All right, so the one thing I did want to share with you first is I want to start with a base level of what is the scenario that we're working with. I'm going to post this, and maybe I can make it a little bit larger. There we go. Can you guys all see the numbers that I'm using here?
Yep.
On your screen? Okay. So I'm gonna address a scenario first off where we have a person that has a principal residence. So, and this is going to be interactive. So I'm going to ask you guys questions, and I want you guys to hopefully answer here. I've got, in the yellow box, I've got the principal residence. I've got the actual expenses. So P&I is principal and interest, taxes and heat. So the total expenses. We can assume that this client has no other debts. It's just purely property. Then we've got the qualifying details. So you'll see that the principal and interest qualifying is obviously higher in the qualifying section than it is in the actual, because that makes sense. So we've got actual expenses of $1,000 per month on their principal residence, qualifying expenses of $1,150. Okay. First question. Oh, and you'll see down here in the blue box, income-wise, the person makes $3,000 per month in income. So first question is, what is the total debt service for this person with just the principal residence? And you guys can feel free to pipe up. You can even tell me what the calculation is, and then we don't need to know the exact number. Feel free. You can unmute yourself.
Sorry, Pete, can you repeat the question? I was reading something.
So what is the total debt service ratio for this client, given that they've got just the principal residence? So we're using principal residence, and they make $3,000 per month.
33%.
No.
30%?
38. Because we have to use the qualifying, right? We're just doing qualifying.
Oh, qualifying.
Right. So under, because we have to use qualifying on principal residence, if we're just looking at residence, 1,150 divided by 3,000, right? So that would be the total debt service. I want to get this out because we want to get these figures figured out. So now, if that person were to, obviously they qualify for that, so that's great. If this person were to take on additional, like if they want to go and buy a rental property, the rental property is now considered to be the subject property, right? All makes sense because they're buying it. They've already got their house. If we're doing a calculation at that point, so they're now buying a rental of their principal residence numbers, are we now using actual expenses or qualifying? This is the non-subject property. Actual, right? So we're going to use $1,000 per month as part of that debt servicing because it is non-subject property. Does that all make sense to everyone? Okay. The rental property, so we're now looking at the rental property. The rental property is described in this kind of peach colored box here. So we've got actual expenses of $500 for principal and interest, $100 for taxes, $50 for heat, and then qualifying is right below here. So what number of these numbers do we use for the calculation?
Qualifying for that.
Right, so we use the 750. Okay, I want to get that out of the way because a lot of times this sounds really weird, but it's important to know when we have a subject property, we use qualifying on the subject property and we use actual expenses on non-subject. Okay, so now this is where it kind of gets fun. I'm going to stop the screen share there. You guys had a sense to see what the numbers were. Now I'm going to get out my whiteboard because this is where things get fun. Where is my whiteboard? There it is. Okay. So now I can doodle along and you guys can see that, yeah? Fun. Okay, so if they're buying this rental property and we're just going to assume that we know what the down payment is, we've verified income, etc. We showed on that previous slide that the qualifying payment was $750 per month. We also, I don't know if you saw this a little bit below, but so that's the expenses. And then I also showed that there was $1,000 per month in rent. Okay. So typically we'd say, well, we know that we've got to kind of look at these expenses and the rent, and we're going to somehow kind of calculate them as part of this, the whole thing. So, you know, a really simple way to think about it is, well, I'm just going to throw $1,000 in with the income. So is it like, we know that the income was 3,000. So we'll just add another 1,000 and their income is, oh, my mouse is really lagging here. 4,000. Is that right? Is 4,000 their income? No, obviously not. This is completely incorrect. We have to take a certain percentage. And not only that, but it's not just a percentage. So we know, I said at the beginning of this thing that we have add backs. And you'll probably see this on either Velocity. I think all you guys use Velocity, so that's good. So there's add back, and then there is, what was the other one?
Offset.
Okay, offset. My printing was so much better when I did this with Lindsay. But anyway, we'll just have to deal with it. Okay, add back. So can anyone tell me what is, if you know how these things are calculated, between these two, how do you think of either one of them? Like, what is it? What gives you a clue on add back? What gives you a clue on offset? Like, how do you remember what it does?
I think it's in the name.
Okay, so
add back makes the most sense. You're going to add it back to your income.
Okay, but so then that question is, we're adding to income. I think that's absolutely correct. Is that whenever I see add back, I think I have to add it to income. So in this case, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say we're adding something to income, but what specifically are we adding to income?
Just the rental income, a portion of the rental income.
Exactly. So on the add back scenario, and this is why I say, remember add to income. Add back is purely taking a portion of that rental income and adding it to the total income. So in this case, I crossed out this thing up here. This is actually exactly the calculation for an add back. We'd have the 3,000 in income, and we would add something to it. Now, I said that this was wrong. this is kind of right if we had a lender that would take a 100% add back. So this calculation is actually 100% add back. But from you guys knowing what you've known in the past, what kind of add backs do we typically see?
50%.
Right. So typically we'd see 50%. So in this case, we'd say add back 50% times the $1,000, which if we total it up is $3,500. All right, so now we've got an income figure. We also have to kind of flip back and say, well, we know what the income is, so what are the expenses? So let's deal with just the subject property for now. I'm gonna switch this screen share back to here. So here's the rental property. So if we're gonna add back, we've already done the income portion. What are we using to qualify? Throw out a number.
750.
750. Perfect. So we're going to take 750 as the expenses. So if we know that for qualifying purposes, this is now considered to be the gross debt service, right? So just we're dealing with the property. So if we're doing gross debt servicing, what is the gross debt service ratio? I'm going to rely on you guys to calculate.
Are you not including the non-subject fee? Like just
Gross
non-subject
debt
property?
service. Right? So remember, I'm being very particular with my words. Gross debt service refers just to the subject property. We're not taking any of the total debt service, but gross debt service. Okay, so gross debt service is what? You
21.
guys, this is interactive.
21.4.
750 divided by 350, or 750 divided by 3,500 is
21.4.
21.4. Does this qualify under the GDS rules? Okay, so we got a big check mark there. Now we know that TDS also has to be calculated. TDS is 750 plus. Now I'm going to flip back here again. You're gonna love this spreadsheet after a while. So which of these two numbers do we use?
1,000.
Thank you, 1,000. I'm hammering it away because a lot of times we get confused. So plus 1,000. All right, someone tell me what the TDS is.
50%.
50%. Oh, ugly. I say ugly. Is it gonna work? Nope. Okay, so we've just done the calculation for an add back and we realized that this client is not going to qualify. Okay, let's go back and do an offset. We talked about how an add back is adding to income. So again, all we did was we dealt, purely with income during the first part of this calculation. We took their existing income and we added the income from the rental. Again, we didn't add the whole rental, but we just added a portion based on whatever that lender's qualification allowability is. So in this case, it was 50%. Most of the time, we'll actually see add back is 50%. Okay, so offset. In terms of an offset, what we're going to do is completely different. We're not dealing with one side of the equation or the other. We're actually going to delve into the rental property. So with an offset, the reason that we're doing that is because the offset is going to form either an income or it's going to form a monthly liability. So I'll let that sink in for a little bit. In the previous scenario, we were dealing with income and we were simply looking at income first and then dealing with liabilities. In this case, we're looking at just the rental property by itself. Okay, so we know that going back to that, the numbers on the rental property, we know that up here is the rental property. So we know that the rent is $1,000 and we know the expenses are $750. What is a typical offset? I've had a frog in my throat all morning, so I apologize. Anyone have an idea of what a rental offset would be? Is it 100%?
No.
80?
All right, let's try 80. 80 sounds right-ish. So if we take 80%, the critical part is we're taking 80% of the income. So think of it like this. We don't know that we're going to be able to rent a rental property out all year. And lenders want to be a bit conservative with how much income they use for the year. So they're basically saying, while we understand that you're going to get $1,000 per month in rent, we're basically backing that off a little bit to account for potentially having a vacancy, to account for other expenses that might come up. They're essentially looking at the income and saying, we're going to back that down. So that $1,000 rent, we're going to turn it into an 80% of that. So we take 80% times 1,000. And that is, oh, my equals just aren't working today. So that's 800, but we still have 750 in expenses. So we're going to subtract 750. Oopsies. We end up with a net figure of $50 per month. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say this $50, because it's a positive figure, is going to be added to the total monthly income that's coming in. So before it was 3,000. Now it's 3,000 plus 50. And that's the total income. So our total income is now 3,050. There is no accounting at this point for the expense of the subject property because we've already brought it into that full calculation. So the only other thing that we have to look at now is total debt service because we're not worried about GDS in this scenario. The GDS already is accounted for because we've taken into account right here the expenses. So in this case, we've got income of 3,050. We have from knowing the prior the prior residential expenses, they had $1,000. Remember, that was the actual expenses. So our GDS calculation looks like this. Sorry, I should say TDS. I'm totally wrong. TDS is now $1,000 because that's the only other expenses that exist, divided by 3,050. And what is our TDS then?
34%.
Does that work?
Mm.
Okay, exact same numbers, but this scenario works and this one doesn't. So what I wanted to point out to you is how different an add back or an offset can be. So you might say, well, hang on a sec. We used 80% in this scenario. We used 80% offset, not 50% like we did in the previous one. What if we use 50%? So I'm going to put it to you guys. What happens if you use 50%? I'm going to let you do the calculation.
You get a negative.
Okay, so you get a negative here. What negative? How much?
Negative 250.
Negative 250. Okay, so instead of this calculation down here, we're going to have a negative 250. So I'll put it over here. So we got 3,000 minus 250. That gives us 2,750. That's our income figure. Our expenses is still 1,000. So what's 1,000 divided by 2,750?
36.36.
36.36. Does it still work? So even with a 50%, so we're comparing like to like, 50% here, 50% here, the offset still works. And this is really the crux of what I wanted to get across to you today, is that given a scenario where we have a lender who only does an add back versus a scenario where a lender will do an offset, which lender would you rather go to? Quite obviously, it's the offset. So again, very simple numbers, very kind of easy to see, but I wanted you to understand how simply adding a certain amount of income to a scenario tends to be worse, because even though your income has gone up, the actual expenses are still the full amount of expenses. Another way to think of this is if you had $1,000 in income and $1,000 in expenses, if you're doing an add back, like an add back of 50%, you're including only 50% of that $1,000 in income, but you're including $1,000 of the expenses still. So the expenses don't get decreased. So on the add back, if you're only getting 50% of the income and all the expenses, it's a horrible calculation, right? Like that makes sense. Whereas on the offset, it's the entire amount that kind of works out to either including an income or adding a slight bit of an expense. And that net amount tends to be a lot smaller, and it tends to affect the debt servicing ratios a lot less. Does that all make sense? Okay, that's really the crux of what I wanted to get across today. Does that at all help you guys in understanding how one works or the other? Okay. I hope this isn't too simple and too basic, but I find sometimes we rely on the calculations of the computer so much that we don't even know what's kind of happening behind the scenes. And maybe that's just me, and maybe you guys all understand this, but I found it really helpful to go through this process when Lindsay and I were doing it, just to understand why kind of one scenario, for instance, that add back just doesn't, it's a really tough scenario to kind of make work. Whereas the offset really does help quite a bit. Cool. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, why don't you play with, 2 or 3 different lenders, pull up, velocity and create a scenario, and you can demonstrate it, a little bit as well. I mean, the entertaining part is always, what's the difference between First Nat Scotia and now Interior Savings?
Right.
Or First Nat Scotia and Valley First. I mean, although they don't do rental properties unless it's an existing client, but
right.
Interior Savings at 90% add back for subject property and some other I mean, you really have to know and look to see how all those fit in, and in each one is got its own little kinks after that.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to get confused with Scotia. It's either 50% offset, in which case you take out the taxes and heat, or you just use 80% offset and leave the taxes and heat in there.
Right.
But, their policy is not written down always, and sometimes that gets monkeyed around. So
yes. Well, and this is where maybe we can take this will be like the basic training, and maybe in a few weeks' time, maybe after I get back, I'll do a training where we actually hit up various lenders and see how those lenders calculate things differently. I think it's a really good suggestion, Chris. What I did want to bring up at this point, I have this is the rental spreadsheet. So I talked about add backs, I talked about offsets. Some lenders will use a rental spreadsheet to calculate, typically it calculates similarly to an offset. So it's something that once you do this calculation here, this will typically result in something that you either add to income or then deduct as a liability. So it's very similar to an offset, but the way that they do it is like Chris says, sometimes they'll include a calculation for heat and taxes, and sometimes maybe they won't. Sometimes they might include something like, so here they've got maintenance. So they might say you have to include 5% for maintenance, or you have to include 5% for vacancy. I'm not going to delve too much into what each lender is looking like, but I think I will do that on another one of these meetings, so that at least you guys can kind of see, well, where's really our best scenario. And I think it'll be a good, I think a good calculation and a good learning experience for all of us, because I don't even know where the best one is. So yeah, have you guys found this helpful? I hope it's not too basic. I really do think that this is one of those things that we don't always go through and calculate. And I find that just doing that manual calculation really helps to solidify why one is different than the other. So yeah. So Chris, I'm going to take your question to heart. I'm going to go through and I'm going to find the various things and go through the policies. And then we'll have another meeting at some point in the future where we'll actually go through and provide those calculations.
So my recommendation would be that, first net, because it's first property, 50% added to income, interior savings, which is, got a pretty good setup. Scotia, because they're standard and they screw around with stuff some on the TDS. And the last one would be ICICI, who's, is very aggressive, and they'll go much higher on the TDS, GDS, as far as that end of it goes. Sometimes they charge a fee, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
So Community Trust, I'm just trying one with them. And to be frank, I'm not sure how they came up with all the numbers that they did compared to what I did. But that was a ugly deal, so that's fine. The other one is Haven Tree. Haven Tree is really aggressive on the offset.
Yeah, I think they're like 80% on them.
85, as I recall.
85. Yeah.
So, but again, ICICI is pretty good because their vacancy is 1% instead of 4 or
right.
Some other numbers. But anyway, that's just my suggestion. So,
yeah, no, I appreciate that.
The new
Anyone
lender
else with questions or suggestions for future?
I was just going to say the new lender we had on last week too was saying they did a 80% offset as well. So that was for a monoline, whereas contrast with First Nat at 50. So that's right. Opportunities.
Yeah, but that's for non-subject property, right, Mindy?
That was, yes, 80% for non-subject.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, I will do that. I'll put together a list of those various things. And again, I'll run a very basic scenario, and then we'll run it through a variety of the calculations that the lenders have, and we'll see which one works best. Just had a comment from one of the brokers here. Strive is okay with considering a lagoon septic. So some pretty weird things.
It's insured.
Yeah. Cool. Well, again, thank you guys for being here. I know this was kind of a short and basic training, but I think it is really awesome. For me, more so maybe than any of you. I really enjoyed the calculations. So if you have any questions, let me know. Shoot me an email if there's a particular lender that you want for that next meeting, and I'll make sure I include it as part of that calculation.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.